You are afraid right now. Not of something specific, not of the lion in the grass or the fire in the house. You are afraid the way water is wet, so thoroughly, so completely that you have stopped noticing it. Fear has become the atmosphere you breathe, the invisible gravity that bends every decision you make, every relationship you enter, every ambition you either chase or abandon. The fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of illness, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of death, that oldest, deepest terror, lurking beneath every other fear, like a fault line buried miles below a city that looks perfectly calm on the surface. And here is what almost no one tells you. The strategies you have been given to deal with fear: courage, confidence, positive thinking, exposure therapy, pharmaceutical intervention, weekend retreat, they are all, without exception, aimed at the symptoms. They are engineers rerouting the flooding river. They are not asking why it rains. The problem of fear that every human being faces actually has a far deeper cause than most people realize. Fear is not a psychological disorder, not a character flaw, not a chemical imbalance to be corrected. Fear is what happens when a mind that misunderstands reality tries to survive in it. Fear is the alarm system of illusion. It is the sound that ignorance makes when it is threatened.
Today, we will excavate the root. We will descend past the anxious thoughts, past the nervous system's hair-trigger responses, past the evolutionary programming, all the way down to the bedrock, where the Buddha found something extraordinary, a structural flaw at the foundation of ordinary human consciousness that generates fear the way a cracked dam generates flooding. And once you understand this, not intellectually, but in your bones, in your breath, it will completely transform not just how you handle fear, but what you understand yourself to be. Because here is the question that should shake something loose inside you right now. If everything you have ever called yourself, your name, your body, your memories, your preferences, your achievements, your face in the mirror, if all of that is a process rather than a thing, a verb rather than a noun, a flame rather than a stone, then who exactly is doing the fearing? And if there is no fixed self to lose, no permanent identity to be destroyed, what, in the deepest sense, are you afraid of? Sit with that, because by the time this episode is finished, that question will not feel unsettling. It will feel like the beginning of your liberation.
Root origins, where fear comes from. The Buddha delivered his first discourse, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, to 5 former companions in a deer park outside Varanasi. He had just spent 6 years in the most rigorous spiritual investigation the ancient world had ever witnessed, and what he found was not a god, not a metaphysical theory, not a comforting story about the afterlife. What he found was a diagnosis. The diagnosis was this: suffering, dukkha in Pali, is not accidental. It is not random. It is not the result of bad luck or divine punishment. It arises from a specific cause, the way smoke arises from a specific fire. And fear, Abhaya in Pali, is one of suffering's most acute and universal expressions. In the Pali Canon, the earliest and most reliable record of the Buddha's teaching, fear is not treated as a superficial emotion to be soothed. It is treated as a symptom of a profound epistemological failure, a failure of knowing. The Pali word is avidya, ignorance, not stupidity, not lack of education, ignorance in the precise technical sense of not seeing reality as it actually is. And what is reality, as the Buddha saw it?
3 characteristics, the tilakkhana, pervade every conditioned phenomenon without exception. First, anicca, impermanence. Everything that arises passes. Every state, every structure, every sensation, every relationship, every cell in your body is in constant flux. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, "You cannot step into the same river twice," and the Buddha would agree, but he would add that the person trying to step is also not the same twice. Second, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. Not merely suffering in the crude sense, but the subtle inadequacy of all conditioned things to fully and permanently satisfy, the way no amount of water can permanently quench thirst, only postpone it. Third, anatta, non-self, the most radical of the three. There is no fixed, unchanging self inside you. What you call I is a constantly shifting constellation of physical processes, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, like a galaxy of stars mistaken for a single solid light. Now, here is the architecture of fear. Because of avidya, because we do not see these three characteristics clearly, we construct an illusion. We assume permanence where there is flux. We build an identity, solid, continuous, precious, in the midst of what is actually a river. And then, because we have built something, we must defend it. Defending the self is the project of ordinary human existence. Every social anxiety, every financial obsession, every desperate need for approval, every clinging to youth and beauty and status, these are all operations of the same defensive project, protecting something that was never solid to begin with. The Buddha expressed it with surgical precision in the Maha-Dukkha-Khanda Sutta and echoed across dozens of texts in the Pali Canon. Where there is something one holds on to, fear arises. Upadana, clinging, is the hinge. Attach yourself to anything impermanent, and you have handed that thing the power to frighten you. And since everything is impermanent, the fearful mind is never truly safe, because it has made itself hostage to an unstable universe.
Wait, have you ever noticed how every solution the modern world offers for fear actually makes you more dependent on what you fear losing? Buy more insurance, build a bigger savings account, improve your health metrics, curate a perfect social image, secure the relationship, secure the career, secure the retirement fund. The entire architecture of modern life is a monument to the project of making impermanent things feel permanent. It is a civilization-scale exercise in clinging. And the result is not less fear. It is fear that has simply gone underground, that has professionalized itself, that now wears the costume of financial planning and personal branding and preventative medicine. This is the fundamental fracture, the collision between what conditioned existence tells us to do and what the Dharma reveals we actually need. The world says, acquire more, secure more, become more, and you will have less to fear. The Dharma says, you fear because you cling, and you cling because you are under a spell, the spell of believing that there is a permanent you that needs to be secured. These two positions are not merely different philosophies, they are mutually exclusive. You cannot simultaneously pursue the project of building a more secure self and pursue the project of seeing through the illusion of self. They move in opposite directions the way light and darkness move in opposite directions. And this is where the teaching becomes, as the Pali Canon itself promises, upanayiko, leading inward, leading toward liberation, not merely toward management.
Fear is not an emotion, it is a structure. Most people treat fear as a feeling that arrives uninvited and departs if you handle it correctly. The Pali Canon tells a completely different story. Fear is not an isolated emotion, it is a structural outcome, the inevitable product of a particular way of being in the world. The Buddha maps this with extraordinary precision in his teaching on Paticca-samuppada, dependent origination. Dependent origination is perhaps the most sophisticated conceptual framework in all of Buddhist philosophy, and it is one that neuroscience is only beginning to approach from the outside. The teaching describes a 12-link chain of causation, each link arising dependent on the previous one, that describes the entire process by which a conscious being moves from ignorance to suffering. The chain runs like this. From avijja, ignorance, arise sankhara, the habitual mental formations that shape how the mind responds. From sankhara arises vijnana, consciousness itself, preloaded with habitual tendencies. From vijnana arises namarupa, the mind-body complex, which then develops the 6 sense spaces through which contact, phassa, occurs with the world. Contact gives rise to vedana, feeling tone, the raw quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that accompanies every experience. From feeling tone arises tanha, craving, the impulse to chase the pleasant and repel the unpleasant. Craving hardens into upadana, clinging, and clinging drives bhava, the process of becoming, of reinforcing an identity. From becoming arise jati, birth, which here means not just physical birth, but the repeated birthing of the I in each moment. And from jati arise jara marana, aging and death, and all the sorrow, lamentation, and fear that accompany them.
This is not poetry. This is a causal map. Look at what it reveals. Fear is not an independent phenomenon. It is downstream from ignorance, downstream from craving, downstream from clinging, downstream from the entire machinery of selfing that ordinary consciousness runs continuously. Fear is what the end of this chain produces, the way a factory produces smoke, as the natural exhaust of a particular process. Think of it like computer code that has been running since before you were born. The source program was written by evolution, by culture, by language, by every moment of conditioning you have ever experienced. And one of the core subroutines, perhaps the oldest and most deeply embedded one, is the subroutine that says, there is a self here, protect it. Every time that subroutine runs, it generates fear as a side effect, not sometimes, every time. Because protecting a self means acknowledging its vulnerability, and vulnerability is the native tongue of fear. The neuroscience and the Dharma in dialogue. Modern neuroscience has located fear primarily in the amygdala, 2 almond-shaped clusters of neurons in the brain's temporal lobes that function as a threat detection and alarm system. The amygdala operates faster than conscious thought, faster than language, faster than reason. It reads patterns and fires responses before the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational reflection, has even been notified that something is happening. This is why fear feels like an ambush. It is an ambush. Your own brain ambushes you.
Research by neuroscientist Sarah Lazar at Harvard showed that long-term meditators have measurably different brain structures than non-meditators, including reduced amygdala reactivity and thickened gray matter in regions associated with attention and interoception. The Dharma is not merely a philosophy, it is a technology for literally restructuring the hardware of fear. The story of Angulimala, a case study in the dissolution of fear. One of the most dramatic encounters in the Pali Canon is the Angulimala Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya,
A story that, read as a psychological case study, reveals something extraordinary about the relationship between identity, fear, and transformation. Angulimala was a serial killer. He wore a garland of human fingers, hence the name, and had terrorized an entire region of ancient India. His motivations, as the later tradition suggests, were rooted in a distorted worldview. A teacher had convinced him that killing 1,000 people would lead to liberation. He had killed 999. He was hunting his 1,000th victim when he saw the Buddha walking calmly through the forest. Angulimala ran. The Buddha kept walking. And despite running with full effort, Angulimala could not catch a man who was simply walking. He cried out, "Stop, recluse!" The Buddha replied, "I have stopped, Angulimala. You stop too."
The conversation that followed is brief, but the psychological shift in Angulimala is seismic. He encounters a being who radiates not defiance, not courage in the martial sense, not the suppression of fear, but something altogether more unsettling: the complete absence of the conditions that generate fear. The Buddha was not afraid of Angulimala because there was no self in the Buddha's experience in that moment that needed protection, not because he was suppressing fear, because the engine that produces fear, the clinging self, had fallen silent. And Angulimala, who had built his entire identity on the power to make others afraid, encountered someone for whom that power simply had no purchase. He dropped his weapons and became a monk. This is not a fairy tale. Read as a case study in what psychiatrists might call identity dissolution, the collapse of a defensive, grandiose self-structure, this story describes exactly what happens when the illusion of a solid, defendable self begins to crack. The violence, the obsession, the grandiosity, these were all symptoms of a self desperately trying to assert its permanence and power against the constant background hum of impermanence. When that illusion was exposed, not through argument, but through the living demonstration of someone who had moved beyond it, the entire structure collapsed.
Application: recognizing fear as a signal, not a reality. Here is something immediately practical that the Pali Canon's framework gives you. When fear arises, and it will arise because you are a human being operating in conditioned existence, you now have a new way of reading it. Fear is not information about the world. Fear is information about your attachment. It is a signal that tells you exactly where you are clinging, exactly what you have assigned the role of self or mine in that moment. When you feel fear around your career, it is pointing to your clinging to a particular image of who you are in that relationship. When you feel fear around a relationship, it is pointing to your clinging to a particular image of who you are in that relationship. When you feel fear around your health, it is pointing to your identification with the body as a permanent possession rather than a temporary process. This reframe does not make the fear disappear immediately, but it transforms its meaning. It turns fear from a wall into a door. It says, here is exactly where the work needs to happen. This next point is critically important, perhaps the most counterintuitive move in the entire teaching.
The paradox of death: how seeing it clearly makes you free. The Buddha taught something that sounds, on its surface, like a pathological obsession. Think about death every single day. The practice is called Maranasati, mindfulness of death, and it appears in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Majjhima Nikaya, and in detailed form in the Visuddhimagga's treatment of the 40 meditation objects. The instruction is unambiguous: contemplate death. Contemplate that death is certain, that the time of death is uncertain, that this body will decay, that all that is dear will be separated. Modern sensibility recoils. This sounds like morbidity, like depression,
like an Eastern version of the Victorian obsession with mortality as a form of self-punishment. But the logic of the teaching is the exact opposite of what it appears. Here is the paradox at the heart of Marana Sati. Most of what we call fear of death is not actually fear of the event of dying. It is the anxiety generated by not thinking about death clearly. It is the static produced by a fact we know but refuse to examine. Death lives in the basement of the mind. We have locked it down there, we feed it through a slot in the door, but we never open the door. And because we never open the door, it grows. It becomes enormous. It becomes the shadow behind every other fear.
The philosopher Martin Heidegger, in Being and Time, argued that authentic human existence requires what he called being toward death, living with the constant, clear awareness of one's finitude. Avoiding this awareness, which he called das Man, the anonymous, conformist mode of everyday life, was for Heidegger the primary form of inauthenticity. We busy ourselves with trivial concerns precisely because trivial concerns crowd out the one great unavoidable fact, and in doing so we live inauthentically, always slightly dissociated from what actually matters, always running from the basement. The Buddha arrived at the same place from a different direction 2,000 years earlier. When you practice Maranasati genuinely, not as a morbid exercise but as a clear-eyed investigation, something remarkable happens. The anxiety that lives in the basement does not grow larger when you open the door. It shrinks, because most of that anxiety is not the fact of death itself. It is the shadow cast by avoidance. It is the shape that the unknown makes when you refuse to look at it directly. This is precisely what behavioral scientists call uncertainty aversion, the research of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky on loss aversion and the anxiety of undefined threat. Their work showed that human beings are more distressed by uncertain threats than by known ones, even when the known threat is worse. The unknown activates chronic, low-grade fear that never fully resolves. Maranasati is, in a sense, the Buddha's prescription for uncertainty aversion. Make the unknown known. Look at it, know it, and in knowing it, strip it of its power to generate phantom dread.
Neuroscience adds another layer. Research on acceptance-based therapies, particularly acceptance and commitment therapy, developed by Stephen Hayes, shows that experiential avoidance, the attempt to suppress or avoid unwanted psychological experiences, consistently amplifies those experiences over time. The mind's attempt to not think about something keeps that something perpetually active. Manasati is the direct antithesis of experiential avoidance. It is the deliberate, sustained, compassionate meeting of the very thing we most avoid. And the Pali Canon promises that what arises from this meeting is samvega, a word usually translated as spiritual urgency or existential shock, a quality of awakened attention that comes from genuinely knowing, in the body and not just the mind, that time is finite and that this present moment is the only place where liberation is available. Of samvega arises not despair, but clarity. From clarity arises panna, wisdom. And from wisdom, the clinging that generates fear begins to loosen its grip. So far, we have established that fear arises from the structural ignorance of self-construction, that it is embedded in the entire chain of dependent origination, and that the paradoxical gateway to fearlessness is moving toward death rather than away from it. But there is one more dimension, perhaps the most radical, that we have not yet touched, and it changes everything.
Anatta, the disappearance of the one who was afraid. Hold on. Have you ever wondered what it would actually mean for fear to completely end, not be managed, not be reduced,
end. The Pali Canon's answer is Abhaya, fearlessness, and the Buddha is precise about where it comes from. It does not come from becoming braver. It does not come from developing better coping skills. It comes from the deep, direct, non-conceptual recognition of Anatta, non-self, and the consequent dissolution of clinging. The word Abhaya appears throughout the canon in descriptions of the Arahant, the fully awakened being, and in the Buddha's own self-descriptions. What characterizes Abhaya is not the presence of courage in place of fear. It is the absence of the conditions that generate fear. This is a distinction of enormous importance. Courage, as we ordinarily understand it, presupposes fear. You are courageous when you act despite being afraid. The soldier who charges into battle afraid is courageous. The person who gives the speech despite shaking hands is courageous. But this courage still lives inside the structure of self-defense. It is a quality of the defended self. It means, I am afraid, but I refuse to let that stop me.
Abhaya is categorically different. It is what the Udana describes in the metaphor of the ocean. The ocean does not resist the rivers that flow into it. It simply receives everything without being diminished or threatened, because its depth is beyond the capacity of any wave to disturb. The Arahant in the Pali Canon is described as one who is free from attachment, free from identification, free from becoming. Not someone who suppresses fear, someone for whom the ground on which fear stands has dissolved. Now, this might sound impossibly remote, and for most of us it is, as a final attainment, but the teaching is not only pointing to an end point, it is pointing to a direction, and even small movements in that direction produce measurable changes in the quality of fear. The physics of emptiness and the Dharma of non-self. Modern physics offers a striking parallel that is worth sitting with for a moment. At the quantum level, what appears to be solid matter is almost entirely empty space. The atom, the unit we were taught to think of as the basic building block of solid reality, is something like 99.99999% empty space. What we experience as a solid table, a solid body, a solid world, is actually a pattern of forces and relationships so stable and coherent that it mimics solidity, but the solidity is appearance, not fundamental reality. The Buddha arrived at the equivalent insight about the self 2.5 millennia before quantum mechanics. What we experience as a solid, continuous, permanent self is actually a pattern, a coherent, stable, deeply habitual pattern of physical processes, perceptions, mental formations, and moments of consciousness arising and passing so rapidly that the mind mistakes the stream for a stone.
In the Anatta Sutta, the discourse on the characteristic of non-self, the Buddha walks his 5 monks through the analysis with the precision of a surgeon. Form is not self. If form were self, then form would not lead to affliction, and one could have of form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. But because form is not self, form leads to affliction, and none can have of form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. And he repeats this analysis for feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. This is not nihilism. It is not saying that you do not exist. It is saying that what you are is not what you think you are. You are not a noun, you are a verb. You are not a thing, but a process. And when this is seen clearly, not as a philosophical position, but as a direct experiential insight, the object of fear disappears. Not gradually, not partially. The object dissolves. Because fear, ultimately, is always fear for a self. Remove the illusion of the self, and fear has no object.
It is like removing the screen from a film projector. The movie simply has nowhere to play.
Metta, the antidote that dissolves the walls. There's a practice in the Pali Canon that addresses fear from a different angle, and its mechanism of action is only now being understood by modern psychology. That practice is metta, loving kindness meditation. The Metta Sutta in the Sutta Nipata is one of the most beautiful texts in the entire Pali Canon. It begins, "May all beings be happy. May all beings be safe. May all beings be well in body and mind. May all beings be at ease and health." And it extends this wish outward, to friends, to neutral persons, to enemies, to all beings without exception. Why would loving kindness reduce fear? The mechanism is subtle but powerful. Fear, at its deepest level, is the experience of isolation, the self, enclosed and defended, standing against an indifferent or hostile universe. Metta directly dismantles this experience. It is the practice of extending the boundary of the self outward until the boundary becomes porous, until the division between I and other begins to blur. Psychologist Barbara Fredrickson, whose research on positive emotions produced what she calls the broaden and build theory, found that positive emotional states and loving kindness meditation specifically literally broadened the scope of attention and cognition, opening the mind to wider perception and reducing the narrow, threat-focused tunnel vision that characterizes fear. Her research showed that regular loving-kindness practice reduced symptoms of anxiety, increased social connectedness, and, crucially, reduced the activation of self-referential neural networks, the very networks associated with the defended, isolated self that generates fear. This is the Buddha's insight expressed in the language of neuroscience. When the boundary of self expands, the surface area of fear shrinks. The 6 practices, a map for daily application. The Pali Canon's path toward fearlessness is not a single technique, but an integrated system. Allow me to lay out the 6 core practices and their specific mechanisms. The first is sati, mindfulness, as taught in the Satipatthana Sutta. The specific application to fear is observation. This is fear. This is a mental phenomenon arising in the mind, not I am afraid. That small shift from identification to observation is the beginning of de-identification from fear. The fear is still present, but you are no longer identical with it. The second is vipassana, insight meditation, in which you observe the impermanent, unsatisfactory, and selfless nature of fear itself. Fear arises. Watch it. It passes. Realize this fear has no permanent self to protect. It is just energy moving through a system, arising from conditions, passing when conditions change. The third is metta, loving kindness, as described above. Its function is the gradual dissolution of the isolated, defended self through the expansion of compassionate attention. The fourth is maranasati, mindfulness of death. Practiced regularly, not morbidly, but with clear, compassionate inquiry. 5 minutes a day of genuine reflection on impermanence and mortality does more for existential fear than any amount of avoidance. The fifth is indriya samvara, sense restraint. This may seem unconnected to fear, but the mechanism is elegant. The more stimulation the sense doors receive, the more craving is activated, and the more craving amplifies the clinging self, and the more the clinging self generates fear. Simplifying external stimulation reduces the fuel that powers the fear machine. In an age of infinite digital stimulation, sense restraint is a radical and profoundly therapeutic act.
The sixth is dana, generosity. The act of giving, freely and repeatedly, directly undermines the clinging to possessions, to status, to security that drives fear. It is a behavioral practice with a philosophical purpose, training the mind to hold things lightly, to trust in abundance rather than contract around scarcity.
Stoicism, existentialism, and where the Dharma goes further. Wait, this next section is critically important because it positions the Buddha's teaching within the conversation of world philosophy in a way that reveals just how far the Dharma goes beyond any Western counterpart. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about many aspects of fear. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his Meditations in the 2nd century CE, observed that the things we fear are almost always either in the past and therefore unchangeable, or in the future and therefore not yet real, and the present moment, the only place where action is possible, contains nothing to fear but our own response to it. This is recognizably close to the Dharma's teaching on anicca, that clinging to permanence in an impermanent world generates suffering. The Stoic prescription of accept what you cannot control and the Dharma's teaching on releasing attachment to outcomes are philosophical cousins. The existentialists, Heidegger, Sartre, Kierkegaard, confronted death with a seriousness that the Buddha would recognize and respect. Heidegger's being toward death and the Dharma's maranasati are parallel in their insistence that authentic living requires honest confrontation with mortality rather than evasion of it. Both traditions share the insight that it is the avoidance of death awareness, not the awareness itself, that generates existential anxiety.
But here is where the Dharma diverges. And the divergence is not a refinement, but a quantum leap. Both Stoicism and existentialism treat fear as something the self must learn to manage, accept, or transcend. They are heroic philosophies of the individual. The self looks at death and says, "I accept this." The self looks at what it cannot control and says, "I release this." But in both cases, the self remains. The subject who does the accepting, the one who does the releasing, that self is taken for granted. It is the constant throughout the equation. The Dharma deconstructs the constant itself. The Dharma asks, what if the self doing the accepting is itself part of the illusion? What if there is no permanent subject to be made heroic or liberated? What if what you are is simply a process, and that process, when seen clearly, has no center that can be threatened? This is not the Stoic sage who faces death bravely. This is the Arahant who has seen through the illusion of the one who dies. Not courage in the face of death, the dissolution of the illusory subject of death. The subject-object structure of fear, something fearing something else, collapses, and with it, the fear itself. Think of it this way. The Stoic learns to stand firm in the storm. The existentialist learns to face the storm without flinching. The Buddha's disciple realizes there was never a storm, only patterns of wind that a mind mistook for a threat because it mistook itself for something that could be destroyed.
Comprehensive summary. Let us gather what we have excavated together in this episode. Fear is not an emotion, it is a structure. The structural exhaust of a mind running the program of clinging to a self that was never solid to begin with. Its root is avidya, the ignorance of not seeing reality as it actually is, of not seeing impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self clearly. Its mechanism is the entire chain of dependent origination, beginning with ignorance, running through craving and clinging, and ending in the suffering of aging, death, and the fear that accompanies them. Its paradoxical cure involves moving toward the things we fear most: death, impermanence, the dissolution of identity, rather than away from them. And its ultimate resolution, described in the Pali Canon as Abhaya, is not the achievement of a more fearless self, but the recognition that the self that was doing the fearing was always a construction, and that constructions can be seen through. The core message is this: you do not need to become fearless. You need to see clearly what it was that was afraid. And in seeing it clearly, seeing it as a process, a pattern, a construction arising from conditions, you discover that the thing you were defending was never quite as solid, as permanent, or as real as the fear insisted it was.
Action steps. Where to begin? Step 1. For the next 7 days, when fear arises, any fear, large or small, pause for 30 seconds. Locate it in your body. Notice where it lives, the chest, the throat, the stomach. Then say internally, "This is fear. It is impermanent. It will pass." Not to suppress it, not to argue with it, simply to observe it with the quality of attention you would bring to watching a cloud move across a sky. Step 2. Begin a simple Maranasti practice. Each morning, before the day's demands arrive, take 3 minutes to reflect with clear, calm honesty. Today, I am 1 day closer to death. This day is finite. What matters most in this finite day? Not with dread, with clarity. Allow that clarity to reprioritize your attention and your energy. Step 3. Identify one attachment that drives your deepest fear, one thing you cling to, your health, your reputation, your relationship, your financial security, and begin to practice holding it more lightly, not abandoning it, not becoming indifferent, holding it the way you hold something precious on an open palm rather than in a clenched fist. Open-handed care. This is the beginning of Vosaga, letting go, and it is available to you right now, today, without any advanced spiritual development required. Start with whichever step feels most honest. Start with the one that makes you slightly uncomfortable. That discomfort is the feeling of a wall being questioned, and what is behind the wall, what has always been behind the wall, is wider than fear could ever be. Tell us in the comments, which of these 3 steps will you practice first, and tell us what you discover. Your experience is part of this conversation. Subscribe to the Buddha Wisdom Podcast to follow this inquiry wherever it leads, because the next awakening is always just one honest question away.
Somewhere in the universe, at this very moment, a star is dying. Not in the way we die, not with anxiety or regret, not grasping at one more moment, not running the calculations of what is being lost. A star dies the way a wave returns to the ocean, completely, without remainder, without protest, without any sense that something precious has been destroyed. Because from the ocean's perspective, nothing has been lost. The water was always the ocean. The wave was just the ocean doing something beautiful for a while. The Pali Canon says something about the Arahant that carries the same quality. In the Udana, when the monk Abhaya, in one of the most compressed and electrifying exchanges in the entire tradition, asks the Buddha to teach him the Dharma in a single breath, the Buddha says, "In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the sensed, there is only the sensed. In the cognized, there is only the cognized. This is how, Abhaya, you should train yourself. No one looking, no one hearing, just seeing, just hearing. The self who stands apart from experience, who needs to protect itself from experience, that self is absent. And in that absence, there is no one to be afraid." This is not emptiness in the nihilistic sense, not the cold void, not the absence of meaning, not the gray flatness that depression produces. It is luminous, vast, radically present. It is the experience of being so completely alive in the present moment that the entire machinery of self-defense simply has nothing to attach to, like a key searching for a lock in a room that has no locks.
We live our lives in the constant, exhausting project of turning ourselves into fortresses. We build walls out of achievement, out of reputation, out of certainty, out of ideology, out of social approval. And then we spend our waking hours defending those walls and our sleeping hours dreaming of the threats that might breach them. This is the castle of fear, and it is self-constructed block by block from the raw material of ignorance. The Dharma does not ask you to make peace with living in the castle. It shows you that the castle was built on a foundation that was never solid, that beneath the foundation is open sky. Fear disappears not when the world becomes safe. The world will never be safe. Impermanence will keep its promise. Death will keep its appointment. The uncertain will remain uncertain. Fear disappears when the illusion of a fixed, permanent self that needs the world to be safe, that illusion releases its grip, or is seen through, or simply wears itself out against the relentless evidence that everything is passing.
When that happens, something extraordinary appears in the space where the defended self used to stand. Not nothing, not the void. Something the Pali Canon points at with the word nibbana, a word whose root means the extinguishing of fire, and which commentators have called the ultimate peace, and which cannot be fully described in language because language is always the tool of the self, and the self has gone quiet. But we can point at it from the edge. We can say it is the experience of the wave that finally realizes it is the ocean. It is the fear that finally realizes there was never anyone there to be afraid. You are not a fortress. You are not even the walls. You are the sky the walls were built inside, and the sky has never been afraid of weather. The ultimate razor. Fear is not conquered by becoming stronger. It dissolves when the illusion of the one who was afraid is finally, mercifully seen for what it always was. The Buddha Wisdom Podcast, wisdom that cuts to the root. May all beings be free from fear. May all beings be at ease.